Welcome to the Get Emergent podcast, where we discuss leadership, team, and organizational topics and best practices. We like to provide ideas, concepts, and pragmatic experiments to help you develop your potential in your work and your leadership. I'm Bill Berthel.
And I'm Ralph Simone.
Ralph, today we're going to talk about trust and how trust is the glue.
Trust me. Don't you just love when somebody says, trust me, when you have no history? However, right, extending trust could be a part of teamwork, right?
Yeah, it can be. I think, it's every context is different, but if someone is worthy of that trust and you sense that you can trust them, let's extend that trust, right? Trust is the glue of all relationships. Trust is that thing that keeps us bonded together.
And interestingly enough, trust is built with clarity. If we think about a triangle of a team, with the top of the triangle being the goals that the team is challenged with, and the bottom left point, the roles, their clarity around roles, and the bottom right of the triangle, guidelines. Then envision glue is what pulls all of those together. Trust is the glue. But one way trust is built is around clarity. Here is what we're driving towards. Here is our expectations of you. And here are the guidelines or boundaries in which you are operating under. It makes trust easier to build. Some people think, you're giving me, rules. Don't you trust me? Quite the opposite. And I think that's a little counterintuitive for people.
Well, I like that. So in that three-part model, that triangle, the clarity of goals, the clarity of those guidelines or rules, and the clarity of the roles all help establish and build trust.
Because now I can do my job. And when I do my job consistently, you trust me, right? There's a credibility, there's an openness, and ultimately a trust.
Well, and I think many of us would at least partially define trust as kind of know what to expect in the transaction or the relationship. And as you speak about having the clarity in the goals, the guidelines, and the roles, it's really about, I know what to expect. That's the clarity. I know what to expect from what outputs are wanted, what the objectives are from a goal. I know where I can operate for that, what those guidelines look like. I have the guardrails. I know where to drive. And the roles, who's got what part of the project, who's responsible for what, is really all about making sure that our expectations are met, which is analogous to trust.
And when that happens, we spend a lot less time and energy following up, worrying, expediting, complaining about someone who has not delivered.
Well, I think Stephen Covey likened it to an economy of trust, right? When trust is high, waste is down, right? If things go faster, that costs less. When trust is low, there's a higher cost. We either have to circle around, refigure things out. There's waste. Yeah, there's an economy to trust.
And so part of this is slowing down to go faster, to have enough clarity to guide people's behavior, but not too much, right? I used to negotiate contracts in a previous lifetime. The lower the trust, the thicker the contract.
Yeah, right.
And so I think when we have trust, we need key information, but it's not unwieldy. It's not unwieldy. We were talking earlier about, when we were preparing for this, the 5 waves of trust. And I think that would be an interesting thing for us to cover in this podcast.
Yeah, so I like the image in my mind of 5 concentric rings, so the first inner, the smallest middle ring, the central ring, that first wave is self-trust. It's having that trust in ourselves, and that could mean the promises or commitments we keep with ourselves are actually kept. I'm going to start a new exercise routine, a habit of walking 2 miles a day. And, I'm not to be too polar or black and white about it, but I either keep it or I don't. I keep that promise to myself or I don't. So I get up early in the morning, walk my 2 miles, wherever I'm going to fit it in, or I don't. So there's self-trust. I'm walking my own talk. So that's that first ring. Why is that important? Because if we can't trust ourselves, we can't start extending that trust with a great deal of integrity out to this next second wave or second ring of trust, relationship trust. It's how we trust in others. and how we give and get trust in our relationships. We extend that trust to others, and we are trustworthy with others in our relationships.
And I think that trustworthy piece has two components. It has the competency to be able to do what you say you're going to do, but also the character.
Absolutely.
And the respect for others. You've heard this story, but I was challenged a doctor that did some work for my wife recently, and he didn't like it, but he missed his televisit with her, which caused her disruption with a class she was teaching. And when he called to let me know how everything went, I said, I was a little concerned because you couldn't keep your commitment of your appointment on the televisit. So I was a little bit concerned with how well you would do the surgery. He wasn't really happy about that.
Yeah.
But I use that example, and not to be a wise guy, but his relationship trust was not high with me. And it was not high because he had broken a commitment, inconvenienced my wife. And so I think while he's a very competent surgeon, there's two pieces to trustworthiness. The character piece is also important.
And I think those two pieces then relate to this next third wave of trust as well, which is organizational trust. Organizational trust becomes this extension of the relationship trust that you have and you build. You need to show your commitment and your competency across all channels in your organization. And so whether that's the business you're working in, maybe it's a family, whatever you want to call your organization, but the organization you're in, from a leadership perspective, you need to be demonstrating on a consistent basis your commitment and your competency across the organization.
I like to say this, although it does come back to haunt me sometimes at home. No one is above the law, which my kids will challenge me. They say, well, Dad, you're not following through on something that you said. Does this not apply to you? And I think in an organization, it applies to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is following not just the rules and the policies, but it's demonstrating the values, the vision, and the mission of the organization. It's operating in complete congruency. No matter where you are, you can't act one way with your team and differently with another. There has to be consistency in how you demonstrate that across the organization.
It's interesting because when we allow toxicity or toxic employees, which often is somebody who is technically brilliant, but is allowed not to follow the values or the policies of the organization, that creates a breakdown in organizational trust.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That fourth wave, this model comes from Covey's work in The Speed of Trust, and he calls it market trust. And I like to think about this next kind of fourth level that might be outside of just the enterprise of our organization, but out into that next ring of other relationships that might be within our market. So it could be within your industry. If you touch out into that scale, maybe you work for an organization that is part of a larger association in your industry. Maybe it's about just that, a specific market or industry, that your brand is trustworthy, that you are a steward and an ambassador of your organization, and then thus inside of that marketplace. This is really important for any leader who's scaling their leadership just outside of the four walls of their organization. And I'd say that's most. This might also go out into, who knows, your next job, your next promotion, those networks that are just outside of your four walls.
What's the fifth wave in the model?
Fifth wave is societal trust. Societal, right? So even bigger, right? These rings are getting bigger. And so now this is out past, well into the community. Some models might suggest global trust, right? That it's out into, far beyond just that market that you work in or that you deal with on a regular basis. This is about your citizenship. This is about, I'd say you're saying no one's above the law is here as well. And now we're talking about the whole community or society. We're talking about being competent and committed in that larger space of your community, of the world. These are sequential. That's why they're numbered, right? And we do start with self-trust. If we have weak self-trust, the rest isn't going to develop very well. And so if there's a starting point, it's starting at self. They all require doing what we say we're doing, right? Walking our talk, and congruency in what we say and what we do, right? That competency and that commitment need to be aligned. And that's how we're seen as trustworthy. That's how we demonstrate that. And it's, I think, how we judge others or deem others as trustworthy.
And I love where you had started, because it does start with us, and it could be as simple as making and keeping commitments to yourself. You used the walking or the exercise example. That's where it starts, with ourselves, making and keeping those commitments.
I really like your 3-part model of goals, guidelines, and roles. I think we can apply that to ourselves in self-trust. I think we can answer, are we first clear with ourselves? Am I clear with what my goals in my work and my leadership development, what I want to get accomplished? I think it's on a daily basis, a weekly planning basis, and a longer term basis. Am I clear with my values, the guidelines in which I'm going to operate? How am I showing up to be the best version of myself? And am I clear on what my role is? Not from a just stay in my lane perspective. I don't really like that. But am I clear on how other people rely on me? Am I clear on what I need to be able to do to stay in high trust?
I love this. I think many people spend more time planning their vacation than being thoughtful about those pieces that you just talked about. Where are we going on this project? How do I want to show up? Which means, what are my values and what behaviors are aligned with those values, right? And what is my role? Maybe I'm not the leader. Maybe I'm just a member. Maybe I'm a subject matter expert, and being agile enough to have different roles at different times, but being intentional. This is really slowing down to go faster, because the trust is often broken inadvertently. I don't think the doctor intentionally missed the televisit call.
Right.
But I think there was some breakdown in the system, in the roles and the goals and the guidelines that allowed it to happen. So rarely do I think this erosion of trust is intentional, but it's often takes place because we don't build that solid foundation. We're not clear.
Ralph, I think that's really important. The vast majority of us are well-intended and very trustworthy individuals. The intention of this podcast is not to suggest malice or ill thought. But when we're not proactive, when we're not clear in either that preparation or planning, sometimes when we're not as open as we can be in that, right? The analogy here of glue, I'm a woodworker and I love creating out of the material of wood. Really good joinery is actually just a little loose. It's not interface perfect wood to wood, because you want room for the glue. The glue is what holds the pieces together. There's a space that's intentional there. And when that glue interface, right, is problematic, right, that's the trust, things fall apart.
I love that.
Right.
I love that.
And so it's being proactive with the plan, but leaving just the right amount of space for that glue, which is the trust.
It's one of the reasons in that goals, roles, and guidelines model, I like guidelines over boundaries or rules, because guidelines provides enough clarity, but it allows enough room. And that's powerful.
Yeah, I love it.
What would we suggest to people? How do you, we talked about starting with yourself, no question, but how do you begin to build more trust, create more glue, which will then help teamwork in your organization?
So I think this is going to resonate with many. At least in my coaching, I find that there is a lack of clarity in many organizations considering roles, goals, and guidelines. I'm not throwing rocks at anybody, but I think this will resonate. That start there. Start with, how can you get more clarity considering your role, the goals in which you're working. If goals is too big, go with objectives, and the guidelines for you and your team. Start there. How start that process.
Then where might you go? Once say you've established that and you've gotten that clarity, where else would you go for building this trust?
So I like to look at the relationships that are around me and kind of assess them on, am I extending trust as much as I would not just like to do, but that's really needed to be more effective with that person? And are they able to trust me at that level? I think with many relationships, we can have that conversation, but I would assess those. I'd go out to that next ring and assess those relationships that are closest and most important. Let's just leave this in the space of work and leadership. How well are you extending trust to your teammates, to your coworkers? Where are the opportunities to do that a little bit more, a little bit better? And then how trustworthy are you with them? Where would they ask for either some small adjustments or changes?
I love this idea of extending trust. Too often I've heard people who they're done with somebody because they didn't support them or they didn't follow through. And I think one and done, it just, unless it's so egregious, but one and done really is not a way in which teamwork and trust is developed. We need to give people another chance to redeem themselves.
I know you and I subscribe to that. We're, I think, more than a second, sometimes third or fourth chance kind of people. Sometimes that's not easy, right? Depending upon what occurred in that space. But gosh, if we're just one and done, we're going to be looking for new places and new people all too often. We're apt to make mistakes with one another. We're apt to make mistakes. We're human. So I think that's another place we can look at. How can I rebuild trust or restore trust with others?
Nice. And I think one of the things you mentioned Covey on this broadcast, one of the things we can do is make deposits into the emotional bank accounts of others, other key stakeholder groups, whether they're key relationships, other people in the organization, part of the market, or part of the society. We can make deposits into their emotional bank account, which will build the trust for future interactions.
No, absolutely. And I think we've talked in a previous podcast about that important ratio of 5-to-1, 5 deposits for every one time we might need to provide feedback that's either a little bit more corrective or ask somebody to do something a little bit differently. So keep building up those emotional bank accounts with others. Nice.
Something that we may want to end with, and I remember I was actually in the audience when Covey was asked the question, Stephen Covey, the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, how do you fix Congress? And
it's a big question.
Be a timely question today.
Sure.
And his response, I thought, was a great example of extending trust and just this deposit that we've talked about. He said, go home and treat your spouse and children well first. Treat them with love and respect and generosity. And I thought that was really, the essence of what we can do, right? We start where we're at, ourselves first, and then with those closest to us.
I love that. Start at that central first wave ring and start at home. Mm-hmm. Ralph, thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
And folks, thanks for listening. You can listen to a new podcast 2 times every month here at Get Emergent or wherever you listen to podcasts. This is where we bring you contemporary leadership topics and ideas balanced with what we hope you find are better practices that you can apply to your work and your leadership. Thank you.